based on their voting records. The proposed amendments to Form NPX may lead to additional costs for funds and managers. Among the costs we identified, important costs include direct compliance costs and indirect costs associated with actions that fund and managers may undertake as a result of the increased transparency of their voting records and practices. In closing, we thank our colleagues from the Division of Investment Management and the Office of the General Counsel for their collaboration. I also thank all of you today for your attention, and we're available for questions you may have. Thank you.
I now turn to Commissioner Peirce.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the staff in the Divisions of Investment Management and Economic and Risk Analysis in the Office of the Chief Accountant and General Counsel. I enjoyed our discussion about the proposal before us today and your thoughtful consideration of my comments. I know how much work goes into a proposal like this one, which makes it all the more difficult that I can't support it. One aspect of the proposal being considered today involves a statutorily mandated disclosure on say-on-pay votes. In a nutshell, Section 14AD of the Exchange Act, which Dodd-Frank amended, requires every manager to report at least annually on how it voted on say-on-pay matters. Regardless of whether I agree with Section 951 of Dodd-Frank, it's the law and the Commission is right in wanting to implement it. If I had my preference, the say-on-pay proposal would be up for Commission consideration as a standalone rulemaking, but instead it's been joined with a wholly discretionary proposal involving a number of alterations to Form NPX, which I'm unable to support. The proposed discretionary amendments to Form NPX are being proposed in the name of enhanced transparency. Our disclosure rules are in place to help investors, but these proposed disclosures could harm investors, as existing Form NPX disclosure may already be doing. At the risk of apostasy, I posit proxy voting is not the most important activity in which a fund engages. Although a fund's voting strategy can be an important part of the overall fund management strategy, how or why a fund votes, or even whether a fund votes on a particular issue at a particular portfolio company, is unlikely materially to influence an investor's choice to invest in a particular fund. The proposing release, however, is replete with statements insisting that investor demand for more data on specific fund votes compels this rulemaking. How many fund shareholders will be poring over the amended Form NPX looking to see whether loan securities were recalled and voted? Or how many fund shareholders will make use of the mandated structured data presentation? And how many fund shareholders will find useful the new categorization of votes by categories and subcategories, such as environmental justice, pay gap, or other social matters? Incidentally, the proposed categorization is unlikely to deliver the goods, given the inevitable lack of uniformity in reporting across funds. The real interest in this kind of detailed voting information seems to come from activists and the ever-expanding population of so-called stakeholders, for whom proxy voting seems to be the fund's highest purpose. In 2003, when the SEC was considering the original Form NPX fund voting disclosure mandate, the heads of the two then largest asset managers jointly penned a remarkably prescient op-ed. In it, they warned that, quote, requiring mutual fund managers to disclose their votes on corporate proxies would politicize proxy voting. In case after case, it would open mutual fund voting decisions to thinly veiled intimidation from activist groups whose agendas may have nothing to do with maximizing our clients' returns, end quote. So while fund shareholders may not be interested in this information, activists of every stripe can use the fact that funds have to publish their votes about socially contentious issues to increase their leverage through intimidation and negative publicity. Thus, these stakeholders can shape how proxy votes are cast. A fund shareholder looking to earn a return so she can retire may not see much value in having the fund manager devote a lot of resources to voting and painstakingly categorizing the votes for publication. The fund manager, knowing that each vote will be made public, may feel pressured to expend more time considering the vote and figuring out how to catalog it than she would if the vote were not required to be made public, and she were just focused on doing what was best for the fund. Moreover, because of the way the proposal suggests leaving securities out on loan as an abdication of voting responsibilities, A fund manager might conclude she has to recall lent securities to vote them, when the extra securities lending revenue might have been worth more to the fund than exercising the vote. An investor is motivated by a desire to see a positive return on her fund investment, and as the nation's capital markets regulator, her interest should be our concern, not the interest of those seeking to use her fund to further their own interests. The call for greater transparency in corporate disclosure is often justified by references to the need to bolster investor protection, but in the case of Form NPX, we're faced with investors needing protection from the consequences of mandated transparency. For these reasons, I'm skeptical of the value of this aspect of the proposal that seeks to double down on the fund vote publication requirement. Our experience with that mandate since its adoption in 2003 suggests that we should consider eliminating it altogether. This fundamental concern led me to ask for the inclusion of a question about whether we should eliminate mandatory public disclosure of fund votes. Had that question made it into today's release, my vote would have been different. Indeed, doing so probably would have only required a tweak to one of the many questions, but alas, it was not to be. So although it's not in the release, I will include the question in the written draft of my statement, which will be available shortly on the Commission's website, and I look forward to hearing responses to that question and the many questions in the release. Thank you in advance to commenters for your insights and wisdom, which will inform my determination about how to vote on any adopting release. Again, many thanks to the agency's staff who worked so hard on this proposal, and I don't have any further questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Peirce. Commissioner Roisman?
Thank you, Chair Gensler, and thank you to the staff in the Division of Investment Management for your hard work on the recommendation we are considering today. As no recommendation gets to the Commission without the scrutiny from our Division of Economic and Risk Analysis and Office of General Counsel, I'd like to thank the staff in these groups for their work as well. Finally, thank you to everyone who engaged my team and me on the matters we are considering today. Before us is a proposal to amend our rules in two ways. First, the proposed amendments would effectuate a requirement under Section 951 of the Dodd-Frank Act that we expand reporting of say-on-pay votes. I have no objection to these proposed changes. I have before expressed my strong belief that when Congress requires this agency to act, we must act. This part of the proposal is a reasonable means of following Congress's instructions. As any proposal, I'm sure this one will benefit from being published for notice and comment, and I look forward to hearing how commenters believe we can improve it. The second part of the recommended proposal would amend the form and substance of Form NPX to both alter and add to the information that investment companies must disclose regarding their proxy voting. These changes are not required by any statute or other mandate, but are within the discretion of this agency. I agree with several aspects of the proposed NPX amendments. Primarily, I support the premise it is true that funds have come to own a huge percentage of U.S. corporate equities and can influence the outcome of a variety of matters that companies submit to a shareholder vote. For this reason, over the past 3 years, the Commission undertook several steps to ensure that investment advisors, including those managing funds, approach voting seriously and in the best interest of their clients. I also agree with the components of the proposal aimed at making Form NPX more useful for investors. When I have reviewed Forms NPX that have been filed with us, I found it frustrating to see funds list their votes on agenda items opaquely labeled as miscellaneous and have to look up the relevant issuer's proxy statement in order to understand what the matters the funds were considering. Additionally, I can see how having forms filed electronically with the Commission in a structured format can allow investors to more easily analyze the content. So, to the extent that the proposed NPX amendments aim to update the forms in these ways, I am supportive. However, the proposed NPX amendments go beyond mere modernization and appear designed to alter the way funds fundamentally think about voting in ways I do not believe will necessarily serve investors. For this reason, I support this proposal as far as it is just that, a proposal. Nevertheless, I believe it's important to explain my concerns, which hopefully commenters can respond to and allay prior to the Commission adopting a set of final rules. The Commission has clearly stated that advisors and their clients can shape the relationship however they choose, including with respect to how and when advisors vote client shares. This guidance should allow for a wide variety of fund strategies, including those that prioritize voting for investors who believe influencing corporate governance is important to their investments, and those that prioritize other ways of realizing value. Maximizing revenue for a fund through securities lending is one such value maximization strategy. Funds can earn billions per year from lending out the securities in their portfolios, which can translate into increased returns for fund investors. I wish there was greater discussion of this in the proposal, and hope commenters provide us with data on this point. The Commission is not a merit regulator, and we should not try to tip the scales, via disclosure or otherwise, toward or against any particular strategy. But this amended form would require funds to report how many shares of stock in a company the fund owns, but decided not to recall for voting. At best, this disclosure seems ill-designed to communicate to investors the balancing that funds go through when considering how to maximize the value for fund investors. When a fund manager is faced with a decision of whether or not to recall shares in a company in order to vote in the meeting, the manager considers where the fund can get the most bang for its buck. A calculus that can involve, for example, weighing how significant that company's shares are to the overall portfolio, how likely it is that the fund will influence the outcome of the vote, and what issues might be on the company's agenda in the first place. None of these considerations are reflected in the proposed new disclosure, and investors will be left to view only part of the outcome of this balancing act, the unvoted shares. Where's the metric of how much revenue the fund generated through these non-recalled shares? How about the fund's estimate of how much return it sacrificed by deciding to recall other shares? Frankly, I haven't seen evidence at this point in time suggesting that reporting any of these three numbers is material to investors, but I think that reporting only this metric gives a distorted view of how managers make decisions and potentially implies that voting shares should be a fund's priority rather than lending out these shares for a return. This implication undermines our prior guidance and I believe could cut off a source of significant value for investors and funds. I hope that commenters will provide feedback on this aspect of the proposal, including whether the proposed disclosure is useful for investors and whether it will introduce a new incentive for fund managers. I'm also interested in whether commenters think we could further tailor these reporting requirements, for example, by not requiring managers that have a stated and disclosed practice of not voting shares to file Form NPX. Alternatively, should certain information on this form only be required if funds have disclosed to investors that active corporate governance is a priority for the fund? Another serious concern I have with the proposed Form NPX amendments relates to the proposed categorization framework, which funds will have to follow when listing the matters on which they voted. I can understand why investors might want funds to present their votes in a comparable category or comparable categories. But the process by which we have devised this framework does not appear to be based on rigorous analysis. Rather than grounding it on a review of proxy voting matters from several prior years, we focused only on the most recent proxy season for which information was available, 2020, and started sorting from there. Moreover, we did not tabulate even these 2020 votes in our proposed categories, and it remains a mystery to me whether some of these categories and subcategories include matters voted upon at hundreds of companies' meetings, or merely one or two. This is hardly a recipe for longevity, which, given that we are unlikely to revisit a rulemaking for several years, causes me considerable concern. By freezing in place categories that reflect issues last year's shareholders care about, we risk relegating future shareholders' interests to an other category that likely will be as useful to investors as the line items appearing as miscellaneous on today's forms. The proposal's myopic focus on the year 2020 has substantive policy implications as well. The most obvious example is our proposed ESG categories and subcategories. In the year 2020, ESG investment strategies proliferated for myriad reasons. Whether they have staying power in their current form is yet to be seen. But by permanently memorializing their interests into our reporting of votes, we seem to be underscoring the importance of these issues to all investors for years to come. As an aside, I think it's interesting that the proposed ESG categories and subcategories stand out from the others on our proposed list in terms of their number and ambiguity. Several of the subcategories in the multiple environmental and social categories are at once incredibly specific and also potentially overlapping. I suspect a large part of the comment file will include feedback from funds asking for clarity on what we mean by terms like environmental justice and how filers should delineate between that in other terms like water issues, which can involve the same concerns. Yet, this ambiguity is typical of ESG issues more broadly. The terms mean different things to different people who have different objectives and interests in obtaining the information.
Stop, please.
Unlike other categories on a proposed list, such as board of directors, audit-related, or capital structure matters, which have less ambiguity in their meaning for public companies, environmental and social issues are largely newer focus areas in terms of shareholder voting for public companies and funds. I believe the difficulty we apparently had even delineating what each ESG category and subcategory covers in our proposal reflects how hard it is to come up with a structure for reporting of ESG information that is comparable across companies, let alone material to investors. Despite my strong reservations, I've decided to vote in favor of issuing this proposal for notice and comment. My vote today is no way a reflection of how I would vote on a recommendation to adopt these rules, but I truly respect the work of our division staff and believe that the public engagement on these topics will be helpful for the Commission. I do think it's unfortunate that we could not have gotten at least one more vote to support this matter, especially considering that we're only a few words and a question mark away from doing so.
Hey babe, do you say yes?
In addition to the requests for comments in the proposal, I'm interested in commenters' views on the question my colleague Commissioner Peirce has asked in her statement,
Yes.
and believe the Commission would benefit from these viewpoints as well. Thank you again to the staff, and thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Commissioner Roisman. Commissioner Lee.
Thank you, Chair Gensler. Corporations are owned by shareholders, and shareholders have a voice in how their companies are run. That voice, of course, comes through the voting rights that are attached to their shares. And who handles that voting? Largely investment companies, or funds, and institutional investment managers, because most Americans who invest do so through funds and other intermediaries. And as a result, funds and managers wield significant influence at the corporate ballot box. Now, opinions vary widely, as we've heard today, on whether to vote for or against specific proxy proposals, and that's as it should be. That's how corporate democracy works. In fact, it's that divergence of views that makes transparency around how votes are cast all the more important, and that is what today's proposal is about. The Commission proposes today the most meaningful improvements to disclosure of fund voting information since the requirement to disclose was first adopted nearly 20 years ago. Today's proposal would also implement a long overdue Dodd-Frank mandate for institutional investment managers to disclose their so-called say-on-pay votes. I'm very pleased to support the staff's recommendation today, and I want to thank the teams in the Division of Investment Management, the Division of Economic and Risk Analysis, and the General Counsel's Office for their thoughtful work on today's proposal. The proposal would introduce several important new features to enhance voting disclosure, including requirements for funds and managers to standardize the description of matters voted on, to categorize the various types of votes cast, and to disclose the required information using structured or electronically tagged data for ease of analysis. Each of these proposed new features will bring greater transparency to how intermediaries cast votes on behalf of investors. I want to briefly highlight two significant aspects of today's proposal. First, the ways in which the proposed disclosure would benefit both investors and the public. And second, the importance of structured data in modern markets to achieve true transparency and utility. Today's proposal requires the disclosure of information that is both in the public interest and for the protection of investors. That is our statutory mandate under both the Investment Company Act and the Securities Exchange Act, the central sources of authority for the actions we take today. The Investment Company Act states that we may require disclosure that is, quote, necessary or appropriate in the public interest or for the protection of investors, close quote. In other words, the statute permits us to serve either goal, and today we serve both. It's critical for investors and the public, academics, policymakers, issuers, and a wide variety of market participants to understand and evaluate the role of funds and managers in the capital markets. Funds and managers acting on behalf of their shareholders and clients have the potential to exercise substantial influence over issuers of all sizes. And in fact, one recent study finds that just 3 large fund complexes cast an average of about 25% of votes at S&P 500 companies, with that percentage only expected to grow, and often with the ability to tip the scales on important matters of corporate governance. Thus, how voting authority is exercised, or in some cases not exercised, is unquestionably significant to the investors who rely on intermediaries to vote their investment dollars. And it's unquestionably significant to the broader public in understanding the influence of these intermediaries in our capital markets. So I hope we'll hear from a broad swath of the public in the comment process on how best to bring this needed transparency. In service to transparency, I'm also very pleased to see today's proposal will require voting information to be disclosed in a structured, machine-readable format. There are thousands of funds and managers, thousands of public companies, and tens of thousands of ballot issues at these companies each proxy season. And voting data is important, not just at the micro level, meaning a specific vote on a specific issue at a specific company, but also at the macro level and in various aggregate forms, meaning whether and how funds, fund complexes, and managers vote broadly when it comes to contested issues or certain kinds of public policy proposals, and how that voting compares to the voting of their competitors and others. Structured data will facilitate both types of analyses, and I look forward to feedback from commenters on whether and how we can further improve the proposal in this respect. Last, I want to just mention one other area where I encourage public comment, and that is whether we have landed in the right place with respect to how often votes must be reported. Today's proposal leaves in place the existing annual filing requirement, but in light of the potential for funds and managers to collectively cast deciding votes on important ballot issues, query whether annual reporting provides investors and the public with sufficiently timely information to effectively monitor voting practices. Have advancements in technology, like the proliferation of structured data and automated voting and reporting platforms, made it easier to report proxy votes on a more timely or frequent basis, whether on Form NPX or on their websites? And if so, how might more frequent reporting assist investors and others throughout the proxy voting season? Now, I'm mindful of the potential risks and burdens associated with more frequent voting disclosures, but I believe it's important for the Commission to weigh those risks and burdens against the potential benefits to investors and the public. Benefits like, for example, being able to engage with a fund or manager in the midst of a proxy season if or when their voting is misaligned with either disclosed approaches or investor interests. Alternatives to the proposed annual reporting regime could include, for example, more frequent website disclosure in addition to an annual filing of the Form NPX, or maybe quarterly filings of Form NPX that align with the fund's disclosures of their holdings. So I encourage investors and the public to help us weigh whether more timely disclosure would be beneficial, and if so, how it should be accomplished. So with that, I'll just say thank you again to the staff for your work on this rule, and I'd like to offer a special thanks to Sirimal Mukherjee and Chair Gensler's office for working so diligently and collaboratively to address comments and get concerns, get the proposal across the finish line. Shareholder voting is at the heart of corporate democracy, and when those votes are cast by intermediaries, transparency is at the heart of our trust in that system. So I'm pleased to support this proposal. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Lee. Thank you for complimenting Sirimal and the chair's office. He's done a terrific job. But I also, in each of our offices for the public, we each get a chance to have counsels to help us on each of the main pieces: enforcement and investment management, corporate finance, trading and markets, and like. And these public servants who don't get in the camera, don't get in the newspapers and everything, are just remarkable and help all five of us out. So I really, a shout out without going each of the names, but in Commissioner Peirce's, Commissioner Roisman, Commissioner Crenshaw's, Commissioner Lee's office, a lot of the work of this commission, we're so reliant on these and remarkable. It's about, each of us have about 4 or 5. And so these 20 individuals are just a remarkable part of the senior leadership team. So thank you for reminding the public and me about that. Commissioner Crenshaw.
I'll just start again by thanking all of our councils and Sirimal Mukherjee for all of his hard work on this.
Hi, Mama. I've seen that name.
And each year, shareholders of corporations are asked to vote on a variety of matters that can influence consequential corporate decisions, including, for example, votes on board composition or executive compensation. Some of the largest shareholders with the most influence over voting are registered investment companies, including mutual funds and ETFs. Almost half of U.S. households invest their savings in these funds. Investors rely on these funds not only to help them save, but also to vote on those consequential corporate decisions. Given the enormous responsibility funds have undertaken on behalf of investors, investors should be able to understand how their money is being voted. Yet this information is not always readily available to them. In 2003, the Commission required funds to report annually certain details about how they voted company shares on Form NPX. While this was a good first step, recent academic work has shown that, in its current form, it's too difficult for many investors to find decision-useful information in NPX reports. Accordingly, investors are still largely in the dark when it comes to how the funds they own are voting their money. Today's proposal is thoughtfully designed to address many of the gaps under the existing reporting regime. In addition to requiring certain institutional investors to report their votes on executive compensation matters, the proposed amendments also would standardize the order in which reporting persons disclose existing information, categorize votes, structure and tag the data reported, and make the description of proxy voting issues consistent across multiple filings. This consistency is fundamental to investors' ability, and perhaps will incentivize investors, to assess how their money is voted. In addition, because all funds will be required to follow the same rules of the road, investors will be able to compare and evaluate voting decisions across the entire market of funds vying for their investing dollars. When shareholders have readily available information about how funds vote their interests, they can hold them to account, which in turn could enhance corporate decision-making. I look forward to reading the comments on all aspects of this proposal, and as always, I appreciate the views of my colleagues and all the hard work and thoughtfulness of the staff in the divisions that have been mentioned here today, including